Hello, everyone. I'd like to wish everyone a very nice Friday evening here on campus and also online, and a very warm welcome to Professor Jacob Dalton. I'm so happy that we have you as a speaker. And I'd like to start with a little bit of an introduction and not very long so that we have most of the time for this fascinating talk on an early presentation of the Great Pefection, Nupchen Sangye Yeshe, on the fundamental consciousness, gzhi. Jacob Dalton is Khyentse Foundation Distinguished University Professor in Tibetan Buddhism at UC Berkeley. Before coming to Berkeley, he worked at the International Dunhuang project based in the British Library and then at Yale University. His interests include tantric ritual, Nyingma religious history, and the Dunhuang manuscripts. And he has authored multiple books. The most recent is Conjuring the Buddha, Ritual Manuals in Early Tantric Buddhism. There are also a lot of other books. I was quite impressed. To give you an idea, Tibetan Tantric Manuscripts from Dunhuang, a descriptive catalogue of the Stein collection at the British Library, The Taming of the Demons, Violence and Liberation in Tibetan Buddhism, Compendium of Intentions, The History of a Tibetan Ritual Tradition, and as I just mentioned, I think it's still forthcoming, yeah? Not yet?
No, it came out last year.
Oh, it already came out, Conjuring the Buddha, Ritual Manuals in Early Tantric Buddhism. So a very warm welcome to Jacob Dalton, and without further ado, we'd like to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you to Diane and Yulia and everyone for inviting me. It's actually quite meaningful for me to be here. So many of my students, my PhD students, come through here, so I feel like I've returned to the source, to the ground of my own experience in Berkeley. So it's nice to be here. So I'm a little bit going out on a limb tonight, speaking about some things I know about and some things I don't know about. Specifically, I'm no scholar of Yogācāra thought, but luckily we have Bill Waldron here, so he can pick up the baton where I leave off. But I did choose this topic partly because I heard Bill's teaching a class here. He probably doesn't remember, but many years ago he was in Berkeley and I was madly asking him questions about Ali Vijnana and this was why. And so it's something I've been kind of thinking about for years. And then last month, David Germano came and spoke about Dzogchen. So I thought, oh, this is actually perfect because this talk is kind of trying to bridge these two worlds of Indian Yogācāra and the 8 consciousnesses of Yogācāra thought, and later Dzogchen in Tibet. And I also am using it as kind of, you'll notice there are some tangents I'm going to go on. So it's partly just an opportunity to introduce you to some new materials. As Yulia just mentioned, I've worked a lot with these Dunhuang manuscripts. So I'll talk a little about that and another text that was relatively recently discovered. So that's the idea. Can I go forward? There we go. This gives you an idea of what to expect here. Yeah, as I just said, somehow I stand between Yogācāra and Dzogchen and Bill Waldron and David Germano. And then basically what I want to look at is early Dzogchen, the very beginnings of Dzogchen in the, well, really in the 9th century. And look at how one author in particular sort of interacted with Yogācāra thought. And in that context, you'll receive this little introduction to Dunhuang documents. And so after going on all my tangents, then we'll finally come to a series of passages I want to analyze with you and maybe draw some conclusions. So, yeah, the introduction. So when I say somehow this talk falls between Yogācāra and Dzogchen and David Germano's presentation at Dzogchen, I want to remind you that David was talking about a specific period in Dzogchen history, which is to say early Nyingtik, Dzogchen Nyingtik, which the texts seem to date from around the 11th through 14th century, sort of culminating in the works of Longchen Ba, although of course it continues through to today. So David mentioned just sort of in passing the idea that there are 11 topics in Dzogchen Nyingtik thought, and I just want to give you an idea where we're headed. This isn't really what I'm going to be talking about directly, but to give you a sense of what the tradition ends up looking like. So this is these 11 topics, Tsikten Chuchik, they first appear in some of the sort of somewhat canonical tantras of the Nyingtik tradition, these 17 tantras. They appear sort of almost like appended right at the very end of the Mutik Changwa, one of the most influential of these 17 tantras. You also find them in the Dratel Gyur, but not listed as 11. They're among a list of, I can't remember, 30, 20 something, and scattered throughout there. But the Mutik Changwa has a presentation of these 11, or just sort of lists them, doesn't really discuss them. And so the first place that you really find them discussed is in the works of this Zhang Nimabum, this 12th century, maybe early 13th century figure, who's quite important in the formation of Nyingtik thought. And he wrote a text appropriately titled The 11 Topics of the Great Pefection, the Dzogchen Chuchikpa, or Tsikten Chuchik. And this text is quite exciting for people like me because, well, as I said, this period of Nyingtik development sort of culminates in the works of Longchenpa in the 14th century, and one of his most famous texts is the Tsikten Gzhi, which is organized according to these 11 topics, sort of telling the story of how Dzogchen works. And there were always rumors that there was an earlier text by Zhang Nimabum, but it had been lost. But then, in 2002, I'm having trouble advancing. Here we go. Well, at first, in 2002, basically, a copy of this lost text emerged. So Zenkar Rinpoche, some of you may have heard of him. He generally lives in Chengdu, and he negotiated an agreement with Pelpung Monastery in Kham, whereby he would pay for new bookshelves for their library in exchange for access to their famous library to digitize the collection. And so you can find a lot of these texts now on BDRC. So the next year, in March of 2002, Karma Delek, this Tibetan scholar pictured here, and Jan Ronis, who took this photo, who is now the director of BDRC, they traveled to Pelpung, and among many interesting texts in the library, they came across this text by Zhang Nimabum. Oh, it looked so nice when now it's all fuzzy. Anyway, but there's the cover page. So the manuscript consists of 130 folios, and the first 97 of them contain Nimabum's work, and the remaining 37 folios contain 5 short works on Anu Yoga, of all things, which is something I worked on a long time ago. But I'm going to set those aside. So interestingly, at the end of these 97 pages, can't read it now, but here's my transcription, and it says, whoever wrote this says, this text is exceedingly rare. It's widely said that the omniscient Dharmaraja, i.e. Longchenpa, relied on this scripture in composing his own works, such as the Tsikten Gzhi. So And in fact, Colophon, just before this, specifies that this manuscript was found in the 19th century, and it was actually penned at the request of Jamyang Khyentse Wambo by a scribe working on his behalf. So we can safely date this whole collection to, the second half of the 19th century. So this is interesting, and it's interesting that even then, this was a very rare text, and people knew, that this is kind of Longchenpa's source. And in fact, when you look more closely, Longchenpa basically copied. The bulk of the text makes up his Sikdunzo. He made interesting changes to the text here and there, and there are interesting things to say about how things had changed or how he differed from Zhang Nimabum. But basically, he copied the entire text to make his Sikdunzo. So this is a really important text, and this is the first, like I say, the first kind of presentation of these 11 topics. So for our purpose, I want to here focus on the first three, just for, again, establishing where we're going here. So the first three topics, this basically is the story, just to step back for a moment. These 11 topics tell a kind of story of how it's the history, the Logyu of Buddhas. And so it basically tells the story of how there's the ground, and then that's the first topic, talking about the ground of existence. And then the ground somehow becomes aware, or somehow not quite aware of itself, because there's no self, but this is all very difficult to talk about in slippery language, but it either recognizes itself, David talked about this very idea, or misrecognizes itself. And if it recognizes itself, that's Kuntuzampo, that's immediate Buddhahood. But if it misrecognizes itself, thinks it's a self, and it then you move on to the third topic, and you're plunged into samsara, and then the rest of the topics sort of tell the story of samsara, and then eventually lay out the practices of Dzogchen Yingtik, the bardos, and eventually Buddhahood in the 11th topic. So that's kind of the story it's telling. So these first three, I'll just read them. This is Zhang Nimabum just sort of summarizing each of these 11 topics, and his summary of these first three reads, teaching how, the first topic teaches how, at the very beginning, the ground, the abiding reality of phenomena's nature abides in the before. That's my translation. It turns out that's from TV shows about the apocalypse. But anyway, I thought it was quite nice. The ground abides in the before, when neither realization and Buddha nor non-realization and sentient beings have yet emerged. And then in the second topic, it establishes, as I just said, how confusion emerges within that way of abiding. And then third, moving on, you're now sort of beginning, samsara has sort of begun, but this teaches how even if sentient beings are confused, the fields of completely perfect Buddhas and the seeds of awakening still abide within those sentient beings, at the heart or something. So, I actually do want to highlight this in the before, draw your attention to it, because this is an idea that we're going to be returning to several times. The idea that the ground somehow abides before not just sentient beings, but Buddhas as well. This is kind of a strange idea in Dzogchen Yingtik, that there's something even deeper or prior to the Dharmakaya Buddha. So that's strange, and we'll be talking about that. But this idea of the before, I would say in Nimabum's writings and other Nyingma texts, they have this very interesting idea of the fourth time. So the three times of past, present, and future are common. But in the Nyingma school, they talk about a fourth time, which is the time, how you describe it. It is, I don't know, my favorite way of thinking of it is it is not separable from past, present, and future. It's sort of the eternal present, that you can't have past without reference to the present. You can't have future without reference to the present. You can't have present without splitting it in reference to itself. And so the fourth time is somehow just the flow of all of this. And one other tantra, the Dratelgyur, says it is without past, future and present completely without differentiating past and future. It's just timeless time. So this is what it means by this is the time of the ground before anything happens. The interesting thing about this story that Gnubs is telling is it's a story that can be applied at multiple levels. It can be the story of a sort of historical or cosmogonic story about kind of like almost like the Big Bang, the beginning of the universe, which the Buddha famously refused to talk about. But in some way, this story is actually getting into it, is saying, well, this is the story of how samsara begins. You can also apply it moment by moment. So actually the story, you're being confronted with the ground and misrecognizing it, since we're all here, all the time. And this story is unfolding many times every second. You can also apply it, of course, sort of contemplatively, if you're resting in a lovely meditation on emptiness and then a thought comes. How does that happen? How does that thought begin to emerge? This is also a story of that. And finally, it is also, in some sense, the story of how Buddhas emanate into the world, how they go from emptiness into appearance in the world. So this is a story of sort of the unfolding that's happening all the time, all around us, and can be done sort of along two tracks, as Buddhas or as sentient beings. So there's this very nice passage I just want to read to you because it's beautiful, from another of these 17 tantras, the Tashi Zeiden, or Tantra on the great exquisite auspiciousness, and specifically talking about the ground. And I sort of like it because it's quite a beautiful mix of talking about this process of emanation out of the ground, and also you get a kind of sense that it's quite experiential and evocative. So I'll just read it. It's like the ground is like a wish-fulfilling precious gem. For those kinds of appearances, my body becomes unformed. The inner youthful vase body's shell of knowable objects is rent open, and it abides in the outer way of being, of spontaneous presence. At this very moment, sort of at the beginning of time, before perhaps in the future have even differentiated it, at this very moment, my appearances burst forth. They appear light and airy, fragile and shaky, evanescent and wandering, swaying and drifting, moving, gathering, and manifesting in various ways. And then the great way of being of spontaneous presence forms. Through its unceasing doors of gnosis, the way, or yeshe, the way of the appearance of perfect enjoyment, the Sambhogakaya forms. And through unceasing doors of good qualities, the way of appearing of the natural emanation body, the Nirmanakaya, occurs. And through unceasing doors of compassion, the impure ways of appearing occur. And through that, the modes of the delusions of appearances form downward, and samsara is established. So in the Buddhist tradition, there are these beautiful paintings of Buddhas emanating upwards and samsara emanating downwards. These are sort of parallel processes almost that can happen with awareness or without awareness. Okay, that's the end of me sort of giving you a sense of this ground and the way it came to exist in Dzogchen thought. So that's our end point. And so how did we get to this point? I want to argue that it begins with Yogācāra and the Ali Vijnana, a sort of famous concept. I guess I'm assuming everybody knows what it is, but I don't know my audience really.
What is what?
Ali Vijnana, or Kunshi Namshe. Okay, yeah. So in Yogācāra thought, there are 8 consciousnesses. And I don't know if Bill's been teaching about this yet, but there are the 5 sense consciousnesses of taste and sight and hearing and smell and so on. And then there's the 6th consciousness they sort of plug into, which is the mental consciousness. You become aware of taste or you think. And then beneath those 6 consciousnesses, there are these 2 further 7th and 8th consciousnesses of Klishta Manas, which is the like afflicted mind or something, afflicted mentation, which is the part that thinks there's a self. And then beneath that is Ali Vijnana. And Ali Vijnana is where the vasanas or bhakchak are stored. So every time you smell something and you think, oh, that's nice or horrible. And by you're engaging in it, you're sort of feeding the karma, and that then replants the seed of that moment back into your Ali Vijnana, and it'll reemerge again. So this is this cycle between the Ali Vijnana and these other consciousnesses that's sort of keeping samsara going. So this is, I hope that's an all right presentation of it. So this goes back to the very early days of Yogacara thought and is quite important to this school of thought. So I'm not the first to talk about or sort of recognize some possible connection between this Ali Vijnana idea and the later Dzogchen Yingtik Kunshi, or Shi, the ground. There's this article, actually, coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, by Bill Waldron and David Germano, who got together and wrote about exactly this, sort of comparing these two ideas, the idea of this underlying basic consciousness that underlies all of samsara, and this idea of the Dzogchen ground that underlies everything, Buddhahood and samsara. And actually, they were not the only ones either. Then David Higgins wrote a PhD on this, on the philosophical foundations of classical Dzogchen in Tibet, and he also talked about this idea. So those are two sources, further sources you can look to if you're interested in all this. But basically, this is what we're looking at. So you get this idea, the Yogacara idea of the fundamental consciousness, or Ali Vijnana. You find it in these early Yogacara texts, Yogacara Bhumi, Mahayana Sangraha, and so on. And then almost 1,000 years later, what is it, 4th to the 11th, 12th, 13th, so 800, 900 years later, there's this Dzogchen Yingtik idea of the ground. So we're between these two poles. This is where I want to spend some time. Part of what I'm trying to offer that Bill and David Higgins have already pointed out is to give a little more specificity and historicity to how this development unfolded in early Tibet, where they took Ali Vijnana and sort of moved into this idea of the Dzogchen ground. So I won't be looking at the Yingtik sources, even though I used that as my endpoint. What we really need to look at is the very earliest days of Dzogchen in Tibet, because it's actually there where you already see them starting to think through this relationship. So that brings us to part 2. Early Dzogchen, my little overview. This is something I've spent some time working on, partly because of the Dunhuang manuscripts. We'll get to that. But so when I'm talking about early Dzogchen, what I'm talking about is this early period between the late 8th century, where you get some of the first writings talking about Dzogchen, and the 10th century, 11th century, where you start to get into the Chidar period and Dzogchen Yingtik and proto-Dzogchen Yingtik writings. And the problem with talking about this, the very beginnings of Dzogchen, is, first of all, there aren't that many materials. And second of all, when you read what there is, they're very kind of poetic and beautiful, generally short works. And yet they don't tell you a whole lot about what the practices are or what the theories are. It's just kind of these poetic, evocative kind of things. And they're often saying things like, you don't need to meditate. It's all over. Don't do anything. There's no Buddha. There's no samsara. There's no, don't do anything. So you're left kind of scratching your head wondering, like, that's very beautiful. What is this? It seems when you look at the very earliest texts from the late 8th century already, that it seems to have emerged within texts that one would classify and classified themselves as Mahayoga Tantra. You know, today you have in Nyingma school Maha Anu Ati. So this is, it seems to have come
This is
about.
all within the Mumbai tradition?
Yes, everything. I mean, well, okay. Everything I'm talking about, 8th through 10th centuries before there were any schools. So there's no Nyingma school yet, but well, you'll see, I'm going to present some of them. They're all in Tibetan, but some of them are translations of Indian, some of them are Tibetan. I'll explain that. But yeah, so these are texts that the Nyingma school today still very much recognizes and takes ownership of. But of course, this is before there are Sarma schools against which the Nyingma school could be defined. So this is the very beginnings of Tibetan Buddhism in a way. Yeah, feel free to interrupt me with other questions, anyone. I don't know. I don't have a totally clear sense of where everyone's at. So if I'm losing you, feel free. Okay, so yeah, Dzogchen, the first inklings in in written sources we have today they're coming out of Mahayoga Tantra. And so, for example, there's the Guyagarbha, the Sangwen Yingbo, that maybe is studied here. And this famous sort of late 8th century Mahayoga Tantra that is very much central to the Nyingma school today. And there are 4 mentions of Dzogpa Chenpo in that text. So you can read those passages, try to get a sense of what's going on. There's also this text, the Mengakdawi Trengwa, which has been studied by many people. It's attributed to Padmasambhava Guru Rinpoche when he supposedly wrote it when he visited Tibet. And it's basically a Mahayoga text. And in there, at one point, he talks about 3 methods, Kye, Tsul, Dzog, and Dzogchen, like Kyerim, Dzogchen, and Dzogchen. So it almost seems like a 3rd stage after Kyerim and Dzogchen. So that's how it's sort of, appearing within Mahayoga Tantra. I'm sort of glossing over some of that. You can ask more questions afterwards, but other sources we have, this isn't a comprehensive list, but to give you a feel, are these Dunhuang documents. So Samten Karme back in 1988 wrote this famous book, The Great Pefection, and he talked about a couple of manuscripts from Dunhuang, and there are some others. What is Dunhuang, you might ask? So that's one of my tangents. That's my big tangent here. So here's the city of Dunhuang, more or less, and it's there today. This is this modern Chinese city, and it's quite an ancient city and was historically very important for trade routes and the Silk Route that went from northwestern China across, this is the Taklamakan Desert, but basically across Xinjiang, down into northwestern India and off into Europe. And Dunhuang, if you look at its location, in some ways, I like to think of it as a kind of the gateway city to, if you're coming in from the Silk Road and you hit northwestern China, Dunhuang is kind of the gateway to China. Similarly, if you're leaving China, you work your way up the Gansu corridor, hit Dunhuang. And then actually, it's not just one route, the Silk Road. You can go north around the desert or south, and they meet up around Kashgar and then off and running. So outside the contemporary city of Dunhuang is this. The slides have been dying to show you. And these are the Magao caves. This is this amazing, probably many of you are well aware of this, but it's a famous UNESCO protected site, protected because of the incredible art. These caves date from the 4th through 14th century or something, but the very earliest ones aren't painted. But starting around the 5th, 6th century through 14th, you get these incredible murals in these caves carved out of this massive limestone cliff face. If you ever get a chance to go to Dunhuang, take it. But these paintings are sort of floor to ceiling statues. And this is, I think, for Buddhist art history, one of the most famous and important sites in the world. And they tend to be sort of ancestral caves built paid for by certain families to maintain their dead ancestors. Here's another example of really incredible art. So around a century ago, the beginning of the 20th century, this was just a ruin. Nobody was there. UNESCO hadn't arrived yet. And there were no Chinese tourists. Nothing was happening. It's just the desert. And but there's one monk who, a Taoist monk, who appointed himself the caretaker of these caves in the middle of nowhere, and he was kind of just puttering about, fixing it up, and he noticed at some point on the side wall of one cave, a loose brick, kind of pried it loose, peered inside, and realized there's a 10-foot by 10-foot by 10-foot sort of square room filled to the ceiling with thousands of manuscripts. So he took down the wall. This is this famous cave, and you can see this door here that was created into the room. And these are painted on top of a photo. These aren't the real manuscripts, but this is still a famous image meant to give you an idea. The cave where all the manuscripts were held was originally, like I said, these are ancestral caves, and there was a famous monk, Wu Hongbian, from the 9th century, who, when he died, they seem to have created this small side cave to memorialize him. And so you can see his belongings and so on hanging in a tree. And some people think maybe there are all these theories about why these manuscripts are in this cave. And some of the latest theories are that this is a kind of funerary cave, and some of his manuscripts, some of his writings, which are among the manuscripts, were put there. And then other manuscripts, he was from a very important family in this region. Other manuscripts from that family were put there. And then gradually it just became this kind of collection that built and built until they actually removed his statue and put it up somewhere else, maybe because it had gotten out of control, and they bricked it over. So in any case, this Taoist monk found this amazing collection, and the greatest number of these manuscripts are in Chinese. So this completely revolutionized. Still today, scholars are working through the history of Chinese Buddhism through these manuscripts. And the second most are in Tibetan. So these are some of the earliest materials we have, and they date from the 9th and 10th centuries. So this is really from the Tibetan imperial period and shortly thereafter. So they really provide a window into how Tibetans were first making sense of Buddhism. So it's a very exciting collection. Where are they found today? Well, shortly after this, Wang Yuanlu found them. This archaeologist, Hungarian, but working on behalf of the British Empire, so Aurel Stein, heard what had happened, and he rushed up there with all his camels and managed to talk Wang Yuanlu out of. He actually compared himself to Xuanzang. He's quite honest in his manipulations. In his diaries, he talks about how he says to Wang Yuanlu, "Oh, you have these stories about Xuanzang, this Chinese monk who traveled the Silk Road and brought back to China these rare Buddhist texts because he needed to bring Buddhism to this land where Buddhism hadn't been established yet." And he said, "I'm from England and there's no Buddhism there, and I'm just like him, and can I take some of these?" And Wang Yuanlu said, "Oh, that sounds good. Yeah, Xuanzang. Yeah, that's good. Here, take them." And so he took thousands of them, loaded them on his camels, and exited to the west along the Silk Road and back to India, where the British Raj was in control. And eventually those then found their way to London, where they're at the British Library today. A few months later, Paul Pelliot, a great scholar of Sinology, heard now what was happening, and he rushed up there and this is this famous picture of him sitting in the cave with the manuscripts in the background. And he took the bulk of the rest of the collection, and it ended up in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale. So today the collection is mostly divided between these two sites. There are other manuscripts, some in Dunhuang and Beijing, some made it to Japan and St. Petersburg, but really the bulk is in these two libraries in Europe. So that's the collection. Like I said, a lot of them are in Chinese, a lot of them are in Tibetan. Then there's a smattering of all these old Central Asian, there were these great kingdoms along the Silk Road, great Buddhist kingdoms like Khotan. And so you get Khotanese, Sogdian, some Sanskrit manuscripts, Uyghur. There's one Hebrew manuscript, all these different kind of, this is a major trading route for different cultures moving back and forth. So my focus, of course, is on the Tibetan manuscript. So just to give you an example of why I'm droning on about this, one of these Dzogchen identified texts, this is in answer to your question, this is actually still supposed to be a translation of a short work by Buddhaguhya or Buddhagupta, an Indian from the 8th century. It's called the Bepe Gumchung. I didn't put the title on here, I guess, but The Small Hidden Grain. And just to give you a taste of what these early texts seem, what they're like, here's a little translation of a little passage. So this one's in verse. Accumulations of merit and wisdom, samadhi, purifying the karmic traces. The stake of clinging is in these. In the sky that's without clinging, there are no such contrivances, like worrying about merit and samadhi and so on. So sitting upright and cross-legged and all, I don't know why that and is there. All such bodily contrivances come from obsessing over concepts of the body. In the sky without action, there is nothing to contrive. So this gives you an idea of what I was talking about. Like the idea is don't try so hard, stop making effort, stop meditating, stop trying to get merit. That's what's causing all the problems. So, beautiful, inspiring, but yeah, a little bit for the scholar in me. Oh, what are they doing? They must be doing something. There's this famous story of Milarepa first studying Dzogchen, and he hears these kind of teachings, and he said, "Oh, okay then, just go out for pizza and a beer, and job done." And they said, "Oh, you missed the point. You better go study with Marpa." Okay, so there's very little theorization of all this until you get to the 9th century and the figure who's on the front slide, Nupchen Sangye Yeshe, one of my favorites of early Tibetan history. This is this nice painting from Mindroling Monastery in central Tibet. And he was an incredible Tibetan because first of all, he lived during the so-called dark period or age of fragmentation after the collapse of the empire in the mid-9th century. And then the Chidar period kind of picks up toward the end of the 10th. So he lives during this time when all the monasteries, most of the monasteries had been closed down. Supposedly nothing was happening. Everything was corrupted. Long Dharma and demons run amok, and just all hell breaks loose because there's no monastic Buddhism. But holding the beacon was Nupchen Sangye Yeshe. And he traveled to India supposedly 7 times, lived in central Tibet, and he wrote a lot of texts that we still have today. Most famously is this Samten Migdren, or the lamp for the eye in contemplation. And it seems to date from the early 10th century. Roberto Vitali is the first to argue this because I think it's been a long time since I looked, but I think he mentions these series of rebellions by the aristocratic families against the imperial family. And the last one was in 904, I think. And Nupchen mentions that he's writing that just after that had occurred. So, very early 10th century, he wrote this Samten Migdren. What is this Samten Migdren? Scholars were very excited in the 1980s or something when they started reading this, because he divides his text into 4 sections on the gradual approach, the sudden approach, Jigchar, Mahayoga, and Ati Yoga, or Dzogchen. So you've all probably heard of the Samye debate. about how this supposed event that happened in the late 8th century, and it was a big debate about sudden and gradual. So here's the text, one of the earliest texts that's really thematizing this, at least in the first two parts. And so the gradual approach is kind of Kamala Shila and more Indian, and the sudden approach, Chikchar, he's citing a lot of Chinese Chan or Zen sources in Tibetan, some of which you also find in Dunhuang. He talks about these, he's basically creating a kind of doxographical discussion, and he talks about them in terms of the different forms of non-conceptuality that they offer. Non-conceptualizing appearances, not conceptualizing non-appearances. Each one builds and moves beyond the previous Mahayoga, non-dual non-conceptualization, and finally Dzogchen, spontaneously present non-conceptualization. Anyway, just to give you a little taste of what this quite long, several hundred-page text is about. What we're going to look at is one that he wrote, I think, just before this Dojal Mumbe Gocha, or Armor Against Darkness, which is a commentary on this Gompa Tupe Do, the kind of the root tantra of Anu Yoga. He wrote a lot of other short texts, which you can still read also. But this is a massive text, fills 2 volumes, and I think it's probably earlier than Samten Migdren, so I'm going to say late 9th century, more or less. And it's a commentary, like I say, on this Gompa Tupe Do, which is also called the Neodzor Drupe Lung. And in fact, in the Samten Migdren, still, that tantra is the most cited tantra in all of Samten Migdren. So he's still very much involved with that text, even after he wrote this commentary. So I said that already. I just want to point out, if you read the Gompa Tupe Do and Nupchen's commentary, today it's famously Anu Yoga, not Maha, not Ati, Anu. But when you read it itself, there's no real indication that the authors or the Nupchen thought of it like that. He thought of it as Sangak, by which he means something quite specific, which is Maha, Anu, and Ati. And he thought of it as sort of the original tantra that unpacks into all the other tantras. So why is that interesting? Well, because it contains a couple of chapters which get completely into Ati Yoga thought. And what results is really the earliest and sort of long theorization of Dzogchen thought. Okay? And this is where we're going to zero in on some specific passages. And this is where he's presenting Dzogchen thought. It's been circulating in Tibet for a century or so now. And he's presenting it. And how does he do it? He talks about the 8 consciousnesses and Ali Vijnana. And he says, Dzogchen is kind of like this, but it is not the same as Ali Vijnana. The ground is the same, but not the same. So that's, now we're finally into the passages after all that framing. So we begin here with a passage where he's clearly differentiating the Ali Vijnana, this ground that stores the bakchak, the karmic seeds, and he's differentiating that from Dzogchen Kunji. So moreover, the Vijnanavadins or Yogacharans and the like, who are undeveloped regarding the meaning, no good, assert the nature of the universal ground Kunchi to be like this. They're sort of objectifying it. They subtly cling to mere nominal designations, and they lack clarity regarding the essence of cognition. So he's clearly differentiating, even though he's presenting Dzogchen in the context of these 8 consciousnesses, which are famously Vijnanavadin. He's saying, but this is different. They don't get what I'm talking about. So in order to make this distinction, he introduces 2 kinds of kunchi, the Jorwatungi kunchi and the Shidungi kunchi. Oops, that's not a shin, that's a shi. What are these? Well, just to give you an idea before we read the passages, Jorwa Dungyi Kunshi is kind of like the Yogācāra Kunshi Namshe, fundamental consciousness, and Chi Dungyi Kunshi is like the Dzogchen ground. So he says about the Yogācāran, regarding a universal ground such as that former one, the Jorwa Dungyi Kunshi, it is like the example of a monk who, through meditating on impurity, this Ashubha Bhavana, like these monks who used to go into charnel grounds and meditate on corpses and so on. And after you sort of meditate on this all the time until finally you just see dead bodies everywhere. So through doing this practice, the monk perceives his entire sphere of experience as a heap of bones. And similarly, just so through being confused about the universal ground, about Kunshi, you don't get it, you objectify it and say it's like this. By doing that, which is the root of all objects, that ground appears as various external objects. So you start seeing objective reality all around you because this one original mistake, objectification, then explodes into objectifications everywhere. Moreover, because it contains all the seeds, it is both the cause, and this is a kind of interesting key point here, it is both the cause for defiled phenomena to manifest, samsara, and the basis for purification, nirvana, because you can do virtuous and unvirtuous. There are non-virtuous seeds and virtuous seeds stored in Ali Vijnana, leading to samsara or nirvana. So it is called the unifying, genuine, universal ground, the Jorwa Dungyi Kunshi. It unifies samsara and nirvana, or seeds that lead to those two. So I always thought this, when I first read this years ago, I thought, oh, that's interesting. Now that's a little like the Nyingtik idea that the ground is somehow earlier, even though it's before time, but somehow prior to Buddhas or sentient beings, right? And here he seems to be saying something similar. And I thought, oh, wow. So this Dzogchen Nyingtik idea is way back there in the 9th century. The ground sort of is prior to either of these. I thought, that's a real Dzogchen idea. Well, maybe Bill knows this perfectly well, but news to me was actually the early Yogācāra texts talk in very similar ways. So this is from the Mahayana Sanghara, and it says, the dhatu of beginningless time is meaning the ground, the Ali Vijnana, is the foundation of all phenomena. Because the Ali Vijnana exists, all existent beings and also nirvana are obtained. And it goes on to explain exactly what I just said, that there are vasanas, seeds that are virtuous and non-virtuous. And so in some way, this isn't an idea that's completely unique to Dzogchen. Yogācāra thought itself has the idea that the Ali Vijnana is the cause, and in that sense, somehow prior to both samsara and nirvana. So in a way, Nupchen and later Dzogchen thinkers are here in this regard, they have some basis there already in Yogācāra. Okay, returning to Nupchen and the Chi Dungyi Kunshi, the Dzogchen ground, he says, well, regarding the nature of the fundamental genuine universal ground, at the moment when the Jorwa Dungyi Kunshi, this Yogācāra consciousness, arises into confusion due to the 4 conditions, it is not just some process of congealment. This is a hard passage. It's not just some process of congealing or coming together with the growth of individual aspects, like building a hut or a house. It's not like you're cobbling together samsara here. Its essence remains naturally unarisen from the very beginning, utterly luminous without being created by any creator, and the unborn true nature of phenomena free of causes and conditions. That is the state of the Chi Dungyi Kunshi. So he's saying samsara is not like breaking this apart and making it into objects. This is never affected by that thinking, that objectification. It remains somehow pure, just like Nyingtik, Dzogchen Nyingtik says. So that's all, surprisingly, here in place in the earliest theorization of Dzogchen in the late 9th century. So this idea that there's a pure kunshi that's maybe in some ways you could even say deeper or prior to the Yogacara Ali Vijnana is not totally unprecedented. And elsewhere in another text by Nupchen, a commentary to this Dzogchen Samde work, Semo Jungyel, he actually talks about this kunshi, this shi dunki kunshi, this Dzogchen ground, as a ninth consciousness, which is interesting. Somehow even beyond the eighth consciousness, the Ali Vijnana. And he further compares this principle of the ninth consciousness, this deep kunshi, to Samantabhadra and utterly pure primordial knowing, Yeshe Nampardapa. David Higgins talks about this idea of a ninth consciousness. And in fact, the idea of a ninth consciousness is not completely unique to Nupchen. You find it in some Chinese writings like Paramartha and Xuanzang, and they talk about this kind of idea. So who knows where Nupchen's getting at, but he talks about this several centuries later. Okay, I said there's another reason why I wanted to just introduce you to some Dunhuang texts. I could go on about this, but there's no clear evidence in Dunhuang, even though many of the manuscripts date from the exact time when Nupchen's writing in central Tibet, but there's really no evidence that his writings made their way all the way up to Dunhuang before this cave was sealed up at the turn of the 11th century, except for this one manuscript. So this is actually part of a set of manuscripts. Iotabje is in the British Library, Paleo-Tibetan's in Paris. So there are these three, and they're kind of versions of each other. But Iotabje 708 is the longest, most comprehensive. And weirdly enough, it follows the same structure as Nupchen's discussion of the eight consciousnesses and Dzogchen thought. But there's nothing Dzogchen about it. It's just a Yogacara discussion. So it's still to this day, I don't know whether Nupchen's writings somehow directly or indirectly made their way to Dunhuang. I think these were penned and written in Dunhuang, partly because they're all similar, but not quite the same. So you can see people playing with these ideas at Dunhuang. Did Nupchen's writings come there? And these are sort of, I don't mean to say Yogacara is dumbed down, but like a dumbed down version of Nupchen's Dzogchen writings. Like, okay, yeah, Dzogchen is these eight consciousnesses, but not these eight consciousnesses. Well, we're just going to shelve that question, and we're just going to use his presentation as a way of talking about Yogacara thought. Like, so it's just a Yogacara text, but following a lot of the metaphors and the structure of Nupchen's text. Is that the direction of influence, or were there texts floating around in early Tibet that were discussions of yoga, of Ali Vijnana and the eight consciousnesses that then Nupchen took on board in his commentary and discussion of Dzogchen? It's still unclear which direction the influences go. These are late 10th century manuscripts. His writing is late 9th. I would like to think these were influenced by him, but I can't prove it. One of the reasons that I think maybe these are kind of dumbed down, like stripped out all the Dzogchen out of Nupchen and just presentations of Yogacara, is that they do have one little inkling of Dzogchen thought in there, which is it begins by talking about the Shi Dungi Kunshi and the Jorba Dungi Kunshi, which are terms that you see all over later Dzogchen thought. You see them in Longchenpa all the way through to today. This idea that there's the Kunshi of Yogacara thought and the Kunshi of Dzogchen. But you don't see it, as far as I know, in any Indian writings. And here they are in early Tibet, not just in Nupchen's writings, but in these manuscripts. But when 708 talks about them, it's not really very Dzogchen-y, and it's clear he's kind of struggling to kind of deal with them in a way that is different. So that's why I kind of think maybe Nupchen, differentiating these two kinds of kunshi makes sense in a discussion of differentiating Dzogchen from Yogacara, but when you're just presenting Yogacara thought, you're stuck with the Shi Dunki Kunshi. So let's see, I'll show you what I mean. So 708 just these are two little passages on these two consciousnesses. The causes that establish the universal ground's particular function are the six collections of consciousness, the six consciousnesses of the senses and thinking. And the universal ground, Kunshi, is likewise the cause for the future arising of sixfold collected consciousnesses. This is what I was saying, how there's a circular relationship. Your sense consciousnesses produce the seeds, which then go into the Alavijnana, which then produce the next moment, and so goes samsara. One causes the other. Thus, it is called the unifying, the Jorwa Dungi Kunshi, the unifying genuine universal ground. So what he's saying here is, he has a different explanation of Jorwa Dungi Kunshi. Nupchen was saying it's because it unifies nirvana, virtuous seeds and unvirtuous seeds, nirvana and samsara. He's not saying that. He's saying, well, no, it's because it unifies all these other six consciousnesses within the seeds and then feeds back into them. So it's where they all kind of come together. So he's got a slightly different explanation of that. And then when he talks about the Shidungi Kunshi, he says, because it becomes a ground for storing these bakchak, these karmic seeds, from both virtuous and non-virtuous grounds, it's called the Shidungi Kunshi. Actually, that's a little bit like Nupchen's explanation of the Jorwa Dungi Kunshi. The reason that it's so fundamental is because it sort of precedes both samsara and nirvana. So that's fine. But both of those are just Alavijnana. Like, why are we distinguishing them as two separate ideas when Alavijnana is both unifies the six consciousnesses in this sense and underlies both virtuous and non-virtuous action? So it kind of, you see what I mean? It sort of defeats the purpose of this distinction. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but it's interesting just to note that there were other Tibetans thinking through this relationship of Yogācāra and Dzogchen and Kunshi and so on. So back to Nupchen. Hang on. We have another passage. First, I'll just read it. However, this is supposed to say, regarding the universal ground, the Kunshi, which is the ultimate. So here he's talking about the Shidungi Kunshi, Dzogchen ground. Regarding this universal ground, which is the ultimate, unchanging, well-known Dharma Dhatu, the undeveloped, like non-Dzogchenpas, assert that Dharma Dhatu, they assert that Dharma Dhatu in its aspect of being a support for purification to be Dharmakaya. They assert it to be the nature of non-conceptual wisdom. That's sort of surprising. He's saying that's a problem, but he's saying non-Dzogchen people, like regular Mahayana, whether it's Yogācārans or not, they see this Kunshi, which is, and they say, oh, that Dharma Dhatu it's identical with, they say, oh, that's the Dharmakaya. That's the nature of non-conceptual wisdom. And he says, this is a problem because it's only the undeveloped, childish kind of people who do this. And just to give you a clue what's going on here, it's because they're saying it's like this, which we saw before. They're sort of objectifying it, naming it. And in that sense, yes, it is in the aspect of its being a support for purification. We all love Dharmakaya. Who doesn't like Dharmakaya? Who doesn't want non-conceptual wisdom, right? So it becomes this ideal to strive towards. So it's great for us being a support for purification, but it's not the ground. Those of the secret mantra of the great vehicle, which is what he likes, affirm the universal ground free from the extremes as the Dharmakaya itself, weird, great primordial wisdom, Yeshe, not appearing whatsoever as any kind of essence. And it's called the naturally illuminated Dharma Dhatu. So seems to be saying there's a difference here. And I do think, it took me a long time to think this through, but I think it's because the difference is really whether it's being a support for purification or it's just the ground somehow, which you can't even say is the ground. It just is.
What does that mean, a support for purification?
I think the best, this is what I'm going to go on to talk about, but I think the best way to think of it is that it is Buddhahood in the path, like as the goal. But the goal is not the goal, because there's no goal. Like, you're already a Buddha, so why would you need a goal? So that's misguided, actually. But yeah. Here's another passage that uses similar language to give you a little bit more of a sense of what he's talking about here. These teachings on the universal ground as the cause for samsara, so this is the bad kind of alivijnana, are ascertained to be unique to the Hinayana system. This is not true. I'll explain that in a second. Hinayana doesn't have alivijnana really, but just a minute. In this context, in terms of a gradual path, this is what I was saying, it was about path that teaches the universal ground as a support for purification, it's suitable for the Mahayana. And since such ordinary beings will not ascertain the ground's true reality, it is taught by whichever one of those two types, meaning you can teach it as a cause for samsara or a cause for nirvana, whichever one you want to be suitable. This is very confusing. What's going on here is he's sort of lining up. He's saying, okay, you can talk about this kunshi. You can talk about it as a cause for samsara. You can talk about it as the eighth consciousness and how seeds, vasanas, are stored there and how the next moment comes out. And this is a kind of science of samsara. And he basically is kind of saying this use of kunshi for describing misery and suffering and samsara, that's Hinayana. Like he's certainly lining it up, even though it wasn't really a Hinayana idea, but he's saying they really focus on using it to explain suffering and samsara. Mahayana then takes it, and there's some truth to this, like in the Lankavatara and so on, they start talking about this alivijnana in much more positive terms. You get things like the ninth consciousness bandied about. And so he's saying the Mahayana then starts saying, oh, samsara and nirvana, they're the same. So this alivijnana is not just samsaric, it's nirvanic as well. So that's why he says, no, they actually teach that this can be a support for purification and is suitable for the Mahayana. But he's sort of saying, okay, fine. It can be a support for impurity or purity, but neither of these are him. He's interested in, like it says in the previous slide, not objectifying them at all. So that's kind of an interesting little passage, but it gives you a further idea of exactly what your question is. What he means by a support for purification seems to be like a goal, an object to strive toward. So actually you see kind of a very similar approach, jumping forward just for a moment to the Nyingtik and our rare recently discovered text by Shang Nyimabum. Others say the three Buddha bodies, this is a bit of a technical passage, but I'll just take it for one point. Others say that the three Buddha bodies and the five wisdoms, the primordial wisdoms, are the path, but not the result. He's involved in a kind of debate with other Dzogchen thinkers. Others say these kind of qualities, they're fine for the path, but they're not the result. When you get into the result, there are no three Buddha bodies, there are no five Yeshe. Regarding the three bodies and the five primordial wisdoms being the path, well, this is a valid statement because the entirety of Secret Mantra asserts, after all, that the result is taken as the path. Maybe, Tantra is often talked about as the resultant vehicle, like you assume you're a Buddha and work from there instead of inching your way up to becoming a Buddha. So he's saying, okay, well, so the three bodies are clearly part of the path. And regarding the claim that they are not the result, this is confusing, regarding the claim they are not the result, well, such a statement is only intended to free one from a fixated clinging that's attached to the result being the three bodies, or alternatively to refute those who assert that the ultimate has three bodies and so forth. It's a bit confusing. What's going on here is he's saying, well, clearly there are three bodies in Buddhahood, but you would never want to assert that the ultimate has these three bodies, and you would never want to cling to it as a result that you're striving toward. It's a little like this kind of move that Nupchen's making, where he's sort of saying it's fine to talk about all this in terms of the result from a path perspective, but from the result perspective, you can't really talk about this. So there's a strange sort of, a little bit of a paradox here. I hope that's clear. I'm just trying to give you a sense of where Nupchen's coming from in talking about a support for purification. I'm almost at the end here. So I've said this before, but again, just to remind you what's at stake here, Nupchen says, by taking this kunchi as an object throughout the 3 times, it will not be found. You're looking for it everywhere, but that's not the way you're ever going to find it. And yet it abides within all those objects of samsara. It's everywhere, but you're never going to see it if you're looking for it as an object. All right. So a little bit of conclusions here, because I sort of, by this point, was feeling a little lost and like, so is it different? He says it's different. Is it different from Yogacara? So we've seen that one way it's not totally different is that Yogacara and Dzogchen both treat their respective universal grounds as prior to, in the sense of being causes for both Buddhas and sentient beings. So to this extent, they're kind of similar still. But where the Yogacara ground is eventually recognized as an illusory object, when one reaches Buddhahood, the kunchi, the Alivijnana sort of collapses upon Buddhahood, disappears, or is transformed into Buddha nature or something. And the Dzogchen ground is always already that sort of non-existent ground that can never be objectified. It never can be that Yogacara ground that is eventually purified. It's always already purified, right? Anytime that the Dzogchen ground is objectified, even when it's objectified as the Dharmakaya, it slips away kind of to this earlier time. So it's always eluding the yogin's kind of thought and grasp. Anytime you think you've got the ground, no, it's not, that's probably not it. So the Dzogchen ground is in that sense kind of always an a priori, sort of, it's always before whatever you're doing. Anytime you think it's happening, it actually was before that. And then you turn to look at that, no, it's before that. So this idea of it being a priori, prior to, is actually quite a sort of interesting slippage in Dzogchen thought from this perspective. It's not quite as simple as in the Yogacara system, where it's just the cause, through virtuous and non-virtuous seeds, it's the cause for Buddhahood or sentient beings. Here, it's really talking about time and slipping away from any objectification. So I think there is, and this is, I know this is difficult. I'm trying to put words to what I find a kind of exciting and beautiful, but very difficult to communicate paradox here in the Dzogchen approach, where this Shidungi Kunchi, the fundamental, the Dzogchen ground, is both Buddha in a sense. You can't objectify as the Dharmakaya, but it is kind of the Dharmakaya that you're trying to get to, and of course, it's not the Buddha. So there's kind of a paradox there. Like, is this great or not great? But the weird thing is, this is only kind of a contradiction or a paradox as long as we objectify the ground. As long as you're trying to talk about the ground, then you start getting tangled up, like, oh, it is the greatest thing, but no, it's before the greatest thing, Buddhahood. And really the problem is we're sitting around having this conversation and trying to figure out what the ground is. Like, that's where you lose your way. So I began this whole talk with the Nyingtik 11 topics and how they outline this history of the Dzogchen ground and how there are 2 directions. You can either recognize, the ground either recognizes itself or doesn't recognize itself. And from there, you get the emergence of samsara and ignorant beings or Buddhas. And now, My computer's doing weird things, but you can't see it, so that's good. So having gained a better understanding of the ground in Nupchen's writings, hopefully we can now see more clearly why these two directions of splitting into Buddhas and sentient beings are really, from the Dzogchen perspective, only one. It's always already just a history of Buddhas, because there never was any slippage. There never was any recognition or misrecognition. It's the true ground is before any of this even happens. And none of that whole story never actually happens at all. But the singular kind of nature of this history, of the 11 topics, this story that it's telling, only becomes truly clear, we're told, when we stop objectifying that story, when we stop thinking about this story of the 11 topics, or the Kunshi and Nupchen's whole presentation. So in this sense, both Nupchen and Nimabum agree that they're telling these stories as upaya, skillful means, but they're really deeply undercutting their own story and saying this is all nonsense. And the goal is to sort of get rid of all this. In a way, this is familiar, probably. So we might end, I love this metaphor, we might end with an analogy Nupchen offers for this same Shi, the Shi Dungi Kunshi, the Dzogchen ground. He says, just as the eye cannot see the eye, because it's not an object, the ground cannot see itself. So you can look all around for the eye, but you can't get behind the eye. That's what I mean by a priori. It's always kind of prior to and behind or beneath whatever attempt you make to see it. So in such ways of thinking, we begin to see maybe how Nupchen really did serve as a kind of historical bridge or a stepping stone between Yogacara thought and early not only between, he's bridging between Yogacara thought and early Dzogchen, but also in doing so, kind of discerning this difference. He's also laying the groundwork for the later Dzogchen Yingtik and its ground and the 11 topics with their sort of non-objectifying gazes and expansive vistas that David Germano was talking about, and all the elaborate visions that he was describing. But you can see how Nupchen is very much sort of setting the stage for all that to come. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Thanks.
We're open for questions.
Shall I? I don't.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the wonderful talk. So I have two questions. So the first one is that I don't have much background in Dzogchen or Tibetan Buddhism, but if I'm understanding right, it seems that the Dzogchen ground, this idea is seemingly based on an ontological reading of Alaya Vijnana and turns it into somehow a kind of a universal cosmogenic ground, even prior to the Buddha and its ultimate unchanging, also the Dhammadhatu, and prior to samsara and nirvana. So my question is that in one slide, you also talk about the causes of the universal ground, like the 6 senses. So I'm wondering if it's the first thing in the beginning of time, like how should we think about this, the causes of it?
Of samsara?
Of the ground.
I get why you say it's an ontological, in the sense that the Kunshi Namche, the Yogacara Ali Vijnana, is kind of epistemological.
Oh yeah. I think because my reading of Yogacara is not ontological. And yeah.
That's, like, sort of depends on what you mean by epistemology and ontology, but I think this is sort of true. Is the Dzogchen ground then an ontological take on it? I can see why one might say that. I mean, it gets into, I can't help, like, there are, Herbert Gunther, David Germano, various people have resorted to Heidegger at moments like this, and he talks a lot about ontology. And of course, and being, the big B being, the very, not all of the beings, the small b beings of all of us, but the very fact of existence, and how this is prior to any big B or small b being. Anyway, this is Heidegger. But so is this ontological? Like, ontology is the study of being, and so is the ground about being, or is it something before being? That's my only hesitation saying, but I can sort of see why you would say it's ontological. And then your other question about.
Oh, that was my first. Yeah, and my second question was that in a way it's both samsari. It's the support for both samsara and nirvana. And there was one slide that talk about when it is purified, it becomes the ninth consciousness. And you also refer to paramattas, the ninth consciousness. So I was wondering if you can talk more about is there any exchange between the idea of the ninth consciousness in the Dzogchen background and the context of paramattas amala vijnana?
I don't know. I mean, I know that Nupchen was, so despite the story of the Sangye debate and that Huashang Mohian lost the debate and was driven out along with all of his followers, and you never had Chan again in Tibet, despite that story, the Dunhuang documents from the 10th century are full of Tibetan Chan texts. And Nupchen, writing in the early 10th century, has a whole chapter on Tibetan Chan. I mean, quoting a lot of Tibetan translations of Chinese texts. So what I'm saying is he clearly was aware of Chinese Buddhism and reading Chinese Buddhist texts, at least in Tibetan translation. Whether he was aware of these teachings on the ninth consciousness, I wouldn't be surprised if they were sort of around in the air and maybe he latched onto them, but there's really no evidence. He doesn't mention Paramartha or Shensang or Amala Vijnana or anything like that.
Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful talking. And actually, I think just what you presented before just offered a lot of materials for the questions which I have already I've also just considered for long. And I have questions that just I noticed that when you talk about the Alaya Vijnana or just Genshi Nangxi, and you also talk about just Genshi, the word just Genshi. And I want to ask just how do you consider just the Genshi and Genshi Nangxi? And do you consider this is a total same thing, or just you just make the Genshi short for Genshi Nangxi, or just these two are different things?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I was completely sloppy in not distinguishing, but later Tibetans many Tibetans spend a lot of time talking about there's Kunshi, there's Kunshi Namshe. Some people say Kunshi is the same as Kunshi Namshe, but it's not she. Some people say Kunshi is the same as she, but it's not Kunshi Namshe. So, so they're quite careful about their use of these terms. In Nupchen Sangye Yeshe, he's not really very careful. And you never know when he talks about Kunshi, is he talking about Kunshi, what I would say, Kunshi Namshe or Dzogchen Shi, which I kind of feel like is part of what is so. Look, I'm not a philosophy person. I work on ritual and history. So if you sense my inability to express clearly these philosophical ideas, this is because this is really stepping outside of my area. But what I find kind of philosophically exciting about his writing is precisely this sort of playfulness, this play on what Kunshi is. Is it the same? Are these two things the same, or are they different? And I think really what he's saying is sometimes he's saying they're different, but other times he's saying, no, they're the same. It just depends on how you look at them. So that's
yes, just I want to just maybe offer something I read before, and this is from Longqingba from his Sangye Yeshe, the first chapter of Sangye Yeshe, and in his very vast auto commentary to his stanzas, and it talks about Genshi and Genshi Nangxi, and I think just Longqingba consider these two are different matters, and based on Genshi, there will be Genshi Nangxi, and Genshi Nangxi is some kind of consciousness which is fabricated, and Genshi is some kind of in Tibet we call it Dimashi, or just it's some in Chinese we call it weifa, means just something unfabricated and just how to say, and there will be slightly difference between these two things, and which will be just they will be how to say come into different Buddha wisdom in different stage. So there will be slight difference. And I mean, just what you just, because except this book, I never just read about these things, but what you just talked in the class course before, and I mean, just awesome. I mean, where a lot of materials, maybe I can just further study, maybe based on this test, but before this, I never just know about these things.
Yeah, I think that's fine. It's an example of how, like what I was just talking about, that Longchenpa is a somewhat later author is, okay, he's deciding to use the terminology like Kunshi Namshe is one thing and Kunshi is another. So that's fine. That's the way he's using it. You know, the later Nyingtik tradition, unlike early Dzogchen, one of the big differences that they make a big thing about these practices of Shenche, like distinguishing like Shi and Choku and probably Shi and Kunji Namche, or Kunji and Kunji Namche, however you want to put it. Whereas the early Dzogchen has a tendency of just sort of saying, oh, they're all the same, like stop thinking about this kind of stuff and then it's fine. So that's an interesting difference between early Dzogchen and later. And Nupchen, that playfulness, that slippage that I'm talking about that is quite productive and I find exciting is sort of spliced apart a bit more in the later Nyingtik writings. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, just okay. So I mean, just for the Nimaba tradition, just I used to heard about this kind of talking, because just maybe for the Nimaba tradition, we have maybe two phases of discussing the dharmas. Maybe first is based on mainly on tantras, and the second phase just now we mainly based on dharmas. And I see just also I have this question maybe in the last how to say last guest lecture, just the other one talked about the early Nyingma tradition, and I just want to ask, I think just maybe for nowadays, maybe we mainly need to based on the Dhamma, but so do you think just what's the meaning if we just investigate so much on the old tantras? Will this be bring us something, how to say, beneficial to our practice, maybe for the nowadays practitioners?
By looking to the times.
Yes, because just I think just
Not in
maybe
everything, only in two things.
nowadays maybe today's practitioners, mainly the practitioners will based on the
Only
dhammas, the
this is
treasures,
explicitly
but just
right.
not so many people they will just to
This
check
is
the
all.
tantras
That's it.
to how to say to guide their practice. And usually I see just everyone just
Sounds
get
good
a
now.
Dhamma choga and to recite the choga. Just I don't see too many people they just use tantras and just
Greed.
maybe just I want to just maybe what's your point about this? Maybe
Well,
just
I think it depends. You ask whether it's beneficial. It depends what you mean by beneficial. If you want to reach awakening, well, you've got your lama you're working with. You better do what he says and do the practices he's trained in so that you can communicate with him. And so stick to the terma, because very few people bother reading these tantras. If you're a scholar and you want to know about the history of this tradition, you want to see how it all emerged, sure, you can look to the tantras. So it depends what you mean by beneficial. Did you have a question?
Thank you, Professor. And the slide before this one, you were talking about how the Yogacharans and the Dzogchen also both describe a universal ground as a precursor, right, to these other states. I haven't heard a lot of discussion around the Yogacara concept of the universal ground. And I'm wondering if you could, I think mostly what I've heard about that has been in terms of sort of like a Tibetan framework, looking back and describing it through more of a Dzogchen filter. And so I'm wondering, I'm thinking about it, and I just keep thinking about the 8 consciousnesses, and, you know, once we purify the alaya, then we can realize the true state, right? But I haven't really heard discussion of a primal state before that in a Yogacara framework. So can you please explain that?
Well, so Bill can correct me if I make any mistakes here, but it strikes me there's a thing called Ashriya Parivrtti or Negur that they talk about finally happens when the Ali Vijnana is like the last seeds are released, and at that point this Ali Vijnana transforms, like Lankavatara or something that takes a more positive approach would say, oh, then it becomes whatever, Buddha nature or something. But it seems to me other texts, another approach might say, well, the seeds go, there's no Ali Vijnana separate from the seeds, actually, even though they talk about it as the storehouse for the seeds. When you get rid of the seeds, there's nothing there. So it becomes nothing. So it seems to me as a little bit like I don't know, this is obviously projecting much later categories, but like a Rongtong or Shentong kind of approach to whether you want to, how you want to talk about that final moment of emptying Ali Vijnana. But that's like my totally uninformed later. I'm a little bit like you, like I'm, you know, I haven't read a ton about it myself, so. Any corrections?
Okay.
I'll be talking about this next week.
Good.
Thank you. I will be there. Secondly, so I was looking at the article that you referenced, written by Drs. Waldron and Germano, contrasting the Alaya Vijnana and Dzogchen models, right? And so Longchenpa further delineates, as I understand, these 2 aspects into 4 types of universal ground. And anyway, so within that, in discussing the primordial universal ground, he talks about it more so in terms of Buddha nature, which was not a term I heard you use. And so I was wondering specifically, when he talks about this, Dr. Germano says this divine ground is explicitly identified as a nucleus of enlightened movement. Okay. Dejin Shikpa or Tathagata or Buddha nature, and that this ground itself is described as threefold: empty essence, radiant nature, and all-pervasive compassion. So I was wondering if any of these same themes and discussion in terms of Buddha nature and its qualities as such were contained in Nupchen Sangye Yeshe's writings.
I think it lends itself absolutely to this way of thinking, and I think, but he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about Buddha nature per se. But ultimately, I mean, what I was trying to gesture towards here, kind of, you end up with something that sounds a lot like Buddha nature, and certainly the later Nyingtik, like David Germano is talking about, is explicit about it. So I think that Nupchen and early Dzogchen, or Nupchen anyway, is quite interested in separating Dzogchen out of Mahayana Sutra world. So he doesn't really get into it as Buddha nature per se, but he's talking about Dharma Dhatu. It's a Dharma Dhatu, and it's the root of everything, and it's luminous and kind of Buddha nature.
Just Dharmakaya versus Dharma Dhatu. I know Trungpa Rinpoche talked about this a little bit, and I think you're referencing something there, but can you say something there, or did you already say something?
Well, yeah, what I was saying there was he's basically saying you might think the ground is Dharmakaya, but if you think that, you're wrong. And when you stop thinking that, it's Dharmakaya. that's, I can't quite, but that's what, you know, the kind of moves that he makes, like it or not.
Dharma Dhatu would be
Dharma Dhatu. He seems to be using that as the correct approach.
Okay.
when you don't objectify Dharmakaya, it's Dharma Dhatu. And Dharma Dhatu is, he's got to create a word that is non-objectifiable. And he seems to feel Dharmakaya is objectifiable. And Dharmakaya somehow can never be objectified. So he's sort of preserving Dharma Dhatu as the non-objectifiable kunshi, and Dharmakaya is kunshi when it's objectified, except when it's not.
Dhatu means sphere or something similar.
Something, yes, sphere,
Space or
expand,
sphere.
space, yes.
And kaya is body, right? So,
Yeah.
Kaya, yeah. So okay. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say.
I'll ask a question.
I have a question here from Zoom.
Yeah, very interesting talk, very insightful and thought-provoking. I'd like to ask a question about the implementation of this idea of kunshi, and maybe thereby connecting to your other fields of research. It's not really a new question. You mentioned in the beginning somehow jokingly about this idea that since kunshi is the basis of all, then there's nothing to do in practice. But then a lot of your research goes, as you just mentioned, into ritual. So how can you give maybe your take on how these early Nyingma masters implemented the realization or recognition of kunshi through means of ritual, or through means of any kind of formal practice, since as you were saying with the laughter, just doing nothing doesn't really work for most people, at first at least. Does that make sense, my question?
Okay. I don't know if you know what you might be trying to get me in trouble here. I'm trying to avoid my real thoughts about it. I feel like everybody, like David Germano, makes a lot of fun of me for my theories here. What the hell? It's in print. You can read it. And people get angry at me. I'm sorry if this offends anyone. But you got your Keirim and you got your Dzogrim, and generation stage and perfection, completion stage, whatever. And those are there already in the late 8th century. And as I mentioned, the Mengyok Tawi Trengwa, supposedly by Padmasambhava, he talks about a 3rd stage of Dzogchen. So, okay, that's all kind of there. Today, what Dzogrim is varies, but just speaking very generally, Keirim, as you all probably know, Keirim is when the generation stage, you imagine yourself as a Buddha. Dzogrim is then you do stuff, and particularly sexual yogas like Tsalung, and all this kind of secret tantric stuff. So the 1st stage is become a Buddha, the 2nd stage, all this, Tsalung. And but when in the late 8th century, when Keirim and Dzogrim first come into being, there's no Tsalung. So what is Dzogrim then? There's no Tsa, there's long, there's breathing practices, of course, but so what is the Dzogrim? Keirim, it's the same, you imagine yourself as a Buddha, and then Dzogrim, you do stuff once you're a Buddha. So in that regard, it's the same. And what do you do? Well, you still do sexual union. That's kind of the main focus of Dzogrim. So that's actually similar. It's just that the practices aren't about Tsalung. It's more about, there are sort of some inklings of some breathing practices, but again, there's no chakras or anything yet. But basically, sorry to get so graphic, but basically from the male's perspective, you retain the drop as long as you can. You don't reach orgasm for as long as you can, but inevitably, eventually that fails. And the bodhicitta, the drop of semen, is produced. And then all these sadhanas, the Dzogrim sadhanas, end the same way. You take that drop. It's just like the Guhya Abhishek, the 2nd initiation today. You take the drop of sexual fluids and you put it on your tongue and swallow it. yourself. It's self-administered. Instead of, in the second initiation today, the Lama does it for you in this second initiation. But in this case, the Dzogchen culminates in that moment. So that's very different than Tsalung, where you're drawing it back up and shooting energies around and so on. Dzogchen exists, but it's very different. So I have a theory that some of these, when I say Dzogchen develops in the realm of Mahayana practice, and when Padmasambhava talks about Kyrim, Dzogchen, and Dzogchen, what is Dzogchen? It's the moment at the end of Dzogchen they talk about. You swallowed that drop and everything just dissolves into emptiness and time stops and you just rest there. And then the rituals say, okay, and then when you come back to consciousness, time to do the dismissal and send away the Buddhas and et cetera, close it all down. So ritually speaking, that's one. I'm not saying that's all early Dzogchen was, but if you want to pin it on a particular moment in Mahayoga practice, it seems like it's often tied to, after all, early Dzogchen makes a huge thing about this word bodhicitta, which is philosophized and much is made of it. And, but in the context of sexual yoga, bodhicitta is a euphemism for the sexual fluids. And I don't think that's total coincidence. So I don't know, it's a little bit racy and a weird theory, but kind of looks that way when you read the earliest discussions of Dzogchen like that. Not to say it wasn't also philosophized and poetic, like the texts you see, like I read from Dunhuang, because when they say you don't need to do anything, you don't need to meditate, you don't need to be in samadhi. Well, yeah, because you're done. You've done the Kyrim, you've done the Dzogchen. You're at the end now. So what would you do? Like you're a Buddha now. You're just resting. So that, I don't know, you can sort of see why they're not describing any practice anymore, but it doesn't mean it's not embedded within a larger ritual sort of system.
Thanks.
And then gradually, David has talked about this, how then it kind of breaks off from Kyrim and Dzogchen and becomes, Dzogchen sort of becomes its own thing. And then later, all sorts of stuff develops in Nyingtik writings and so on.
There are some questions from the...
That's silenced.
There are some questions from the online audience. The first question is, are you getting at the experience of priori thinking? Is this the fact of experience plus non-conceptual thought?
Maybe that's one way of putting it. The word experience is kind of a touchy one because it depends what you mean by experience. We all have experiences, but as soon as you are having an experience, you're kind of not in non-conceptuality anymore. So, it's like the standard idea that like nobody actually becomes a Buddha. There's no self anymore. So who would possibly be having an experience? So I don't know what, I didn't even see who was reading that, but I don't know what this particular questioner has in mind, but I do think there's something nice about that idea that what Nupchen Sangye Yeshe is talking about is something that is, I hate to use the word experience, but yeah, you're right. There's no other word, like it's being experienced. It's not then being talked about. It only happens when it's happening, not when you're thinking about it afterwards or something. Maybe that's what the question had in mind. It's process oriented somehow.
Thank you. The next question is, aren't Dharmakaya and Dharmadhatu beginninglessly inseparable?
Yeah, I would say so. So better not to separate them. But I guess in using Nupchen's terminology, as soon as you start talking about Dharmakaya, you've separated it. So then He shouldn't do that.
All right, so
I don't know what to say.
the next question has a comment as well, and it's first of all some reference in Samten Migron Mahayoga, 5 equities section. Nupchen is talking about these 2 types of the ground, and he is referring to Padmasambhava and another teacher named Madhu. The question is, what is the current state of identifying the country of Brusha where Nupchen went to learn Yoga?
So you can read the chapter 1 of Gathering the Intentions, where I talk about this, but Brusha is probably in modern day Pakistan near Gilgit. And there's a language called Brushake, or Drushake. And so it's probably, yeah, that's it. I think I used to read about this. This is like 25 years ago, but it's a very interesting language for linguists. It's like Finnish and Hungarian, one of these languages that seems to not be related to anything. So linguists love it. And I remember reading all about it at the time. And apparently these people, Brusha people, moved to a different valley at some point in the past. But there are lots of accounts in Chinese Tang dynasty accounts and early Tibetan accounts of this kingdom, Brusha. And it seems to be somewhere around there. And it was a great Buddhist kingdom at one point. And the Anu Yoga Tantra, Gompa Dupe Do, that is the Sagyu, this whole commentary we've been talking about is by Nupchen, is discussing that Tantra, weirdly, is supposedly translated not from Sanskrit, but from Brushake. So that's a weird one. It's a very strange, and in fact, in Nupchen's commentary, he, especially in certain parts, you can read the chapter, but he leaves untranslated Brushake words, and then, or the Tantra does, and then Nupchen in his commentary says, "Oh, this is Brushake. This means this. This means that." So that's an interesting, strange thing. It's a strange Tantra. Okay.
No, there's one final question. Could you please explain the process of karma, that how it will remain in mind store and experience in rebirth?
How it will remain where?
In mind store, and I have to imagine this means alaya. Yeah.
Explain how it works.
Could you please explain the process of karma, that how it will remain in mind store and experience in rebirth?
Well, I can only do it in very general terms, but a little like what I said already, like we have a particular experience, like a smell, like I was saying, and then we, engage with it with our minds, and that moment of engagement then kind of objectifies it and makes it into an object separate from subject, and we start thinking dualistically about it, and we say whether we like it or not, and we have all these reactions to it, and then that kind of creates a habit of thought in our minds, and those habits, it's like grooves, tires in a muddy road, like it's digging these grooves of thought, the habitual. Next time you're a little bit more likely to objectify that particular smell and say that's gross. So these habitual, these actions then leave grooves or seeds in your unconscious, in the Ali Vijnana, and then they reemerge in the future to further shape your next moment. And then you engage based on those memories and past experiences and seeds, and then that engagement then replants the seed, and it goes around and around. So I don't know. I don't know if that's a very satisfying explanation, but that's where Ali Vijnana comes from, I think.
And there's another question, which is, All right, and this will be the last one. We are not taking questions anymore. What is the final goal? What will happen with Professor if he achieved the fruit of Dzogchen?
I could take an early retirement. Yeah, I would blink out of existence and there'd be rainbows everywhere. It would be great. Not likely, but it would be nice.
And there was a question I missed, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask that one. Sorry, very, very sorry about that. Is it possible that there may be pre-Buddhist ways of thinking of something equivalent to the ground, such as Patanjali Yoga?
Oh God, I don't. I honestly don't know, but the idea, very coarsely put, is Schmidhausen, this German scholar, has a whole study on Ali Vijnana, and he makes the suggestion that this concept was developed in Buddhist thought partly to solve a problem, which is that there is something called Nirodha Samapatti, like the state of meditation where it's kind of like a blackout state. If you ever have had general anesthetic, I always imagine it like that. But anyway, the idea is that you can attain this just absolute nothingness, no memory, no sense of self. I mean, there's a very subtle sense of self, but there's no mind anymore. The texts are pretty clear about that. And so then the question is, well, then when you come back out of that state, why are you still you? Like if the mind was just obliterated by that state, how does the mind restart again and you still look like you and still have the same experiences? So despite text very clearly saying there's no mind, there must be something there still. And so they create this even deeper state of consciousness, Ali Vijnana, to kind of explain. So it remains active in this blackout state, basically, and then can regenerate when you come out of it. So, you know, I think that I would tend to think, given what Schmidhausen says, that I prefer to think of it as solving a problem in Buddhist thought rather than reacting to non-Buddhist thought. Not to say it wasn't maybe in conversation in later centuries. Thank you.